Hear me all right? Great, thank you, Robert. So I'm hoping this will be at least one of our last virtual meetings, so stay tuned for more information on that. But as always, we're using Teams today, so please keep yourself muted if you're not speaking, and utilize the raise hand function if you have a question or comment. Sean Halter from GNRC will be managing the chat box today. But without further ado, I'll head into the agenda. So we'll start with some introductions as we have a few new members on the call today, and then we'll have a quick recap of the previous meeting and the work we've done since. Then an update on counter selection. From there, we'll have Ashley Glasscock from our data team present her new month-to-date safety dashboard. And then we'll continue our discussion on safety, finishing up with some next steps and member updates. So before we start the meeting, I'll pause now to let a few new members introduce themselves. If you could tell us your name, what organization you represent, and if you want your preferred mode of transportation.
Well, why don't I start, Daniel? Is that appropriate?
Sure, go ahead, Robert.
My name is Robert Johnson. I work for the Tennessee DOT. I'm an active transport analyst working for Daniel McDonnell and Vida Wynn in the multimodal resources office. I manage some grant monies and I review projects to see how TDOT is accommodating all multimodal users in project proposals. Those are my key tasks. And my favorite mode of transport is a cargo bicycle that enables me to carry my two children wherever I go and to go shopping by bicycle.
Thank you, Robert. Cedric or Tina, do you all want to go next?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I am Tina Fox. I am the organizer of Black Girls Do Bike Nashville, and I am honored and privileged to be here this morning. And my favorite mode of transportation, obviously, is the bike. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Tina. Glad to have you on. Cedric?
Hey, my name is Cedric Duncan, and I'm with a group called Bike for Equality, and we do a lot of, or promote a lot of biking rides and groups and all through Nashville, just helping to raise awareness about racial equality as well as just every type of clean air, transit, and all that type of stuff. But let's see. My favorite mode of transportation, I feel like, I think I might be lying if I said bike. I think trains are my favorite type of transportation. I got pretty addicted to them when I was in Europe for a while. So I am pretty obsessed with trains now. I'm a huge advocate for trains. I hope Amtrak gets better in the United States, but I think trains are my favorite mode of transportation.
All right, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Cedric. I'll go ahead and move on to our recap. So last meeting we heard from Andy Barlow from the city of Mount Juliet and their new town center trail, and saw how much of a positive impact a really comprehensive greenway project can make on a suburban community such as Mount Juliet. We debriefed the pedestrian safety workshop and the Power of 10 City Streets webinar. Since then, we have opened our call for projects for the COVID relief funding that are regional, which I'll cover in more detail in our member updates. So you may remember last year, TDOT announced their Active Transportation Counts program for MPO regions across the state. And a few months ago, back in March, we heard from Ashley Hunter-Mason, TDOT's Active Transportation Counts coordinator, about their counts program and what steps we need to take to get the program started in our region, as well as an overview of the program. And then we asked you, members of the BPAC, to provide us with potential counter locations to get us started in the test phase And with some of your input, we put together a draft list of counter locations. As a reminder, we're hoping to accomplish a few things with this program. We want to more accurately count bicyclists and pedestrians. We want to estimate the demand for new facilities, and we want to analyze the benefits of our investments in bike and pedestrian infrastructure. So we sent out a shared Google map to you all and built criteria off of that to produce the draft list of locations. The majority of locations submitted were in Metro Nashville, so we wanted to make sure this was truly a regional program. And while we wish we had access to more counters, we only have between 12 and 15. So we wanted to have a more regional data set. So we chose a few additional locations with respect to geographic equity, representing all 7 counties in the region. We also tried to have a mix of urban, suburban, and more rural locations to gather a more complete data set. And since we've done a lot of crash analysis lately related to transit usage, we wanted to have counters that captured pedestrian and bicycle trips to and from transit. In terms of demand, we want to put counters where we expect there to be people walking and biking so that we can get an accurate data set. There were also some requirements from TDOT in terms of physical installation. So the counters can't face foliage, they can't face traffic. It has to be on an existing sidewalk, bike lane, or greenway path. In terms of trip type, this is hard in our region as we don't have that established of a commuter network by walking and biking, but we wanted to represent at least some sort of mix between recreational trips and commuters so that it could be as similar as possible to traffic counts in its foundation. So here's a map of the draft locations. I'll send you a link so you all can explore. But we're looking for you to look through the locations and provide us with any feedback that you may have. So I'm going to pull this up real quick so that I can demo it. So if you click on any of these blue pins, you can see city, county, and coast information. So for example, here's the Shelby Bundes Greenway. County is Davidson, city is Metro Nashville. We will put it on the Greenway entrance sign. The factor group is mostly recreation. Then you can see why we chose recreation. So for instance, here's another one in Antioch, near Antioch Middle School, and Antioch Park. And you can see all of that information. So you all can explore that on your own time and let us know in the next month or so whether you agree with the locations and if you support them or if you have any additional locations.
Do we know when they'll be installed?
Sorry, repeat that, Raj?
Do you know when they will be installed?
Oh, sorry, that was Michelle. No, we are not sure about that yet. We don't currently have a timeline from TDOT, so we're still waiting to hear back from Ashley in terms of when we're able to procure those counters.
Daniel, did I hear you say suggestions for additional counters? I apologise that I have not done homework on the programme despite working for TDOT, but did I hear you say additional counters or not?
Just if you don't agree with the locations that we have on the list, if you have any suggestions for maybe a replacement location or an additional location just to include in our list, then we welcome that.
Okay, cool, thank you.
And Daniel, the link is in the chat?
No, the link is not in the chat, but I can put it in there right now.
Thank you.
All right, the link is now in the chat. So here is the list of locations. The ones highlighted in blue are locations you all submitted that we thought matched up with the criteria well, but others we added to better meet criteria since the majority of locations you all submitted were in Metro Nashville. So for example, the Nolensville Walmart, we thought since that was in close proximity to transit usage, also in a high crash area, and also had high pedestrian demand. So before we do anything, we want to confirm with you all. Unfortunately, we don't know the timeline, as I mentioned before. But once we hear from TDOT that they've contracted with the manufacturer and procured counters, we'll hopefully be ready to go. So TDOT has asked us to send along our draft locations list so that once they are ready, implementation will be hopefully quicker than if we had to find out where we were going to place them. So after we do that, we can hopefully start with install. So that's phase 2. And then the next year is basically our test phase. We want to make sure that we can use the data that we're accumulating. And then for phase 3, after a year, the initial year, if everything checks out, TDOT will provide us with permanent counters, and we can use the portable counters that we get for the first phase really as we want to for project studies or before and after studies or really anything else. So that's all I've got in terms of counters. Does anybody have any additional questions before I move on?
I wonder if it makes sense to, oh, go ahead.
I was curious what these counters look like and where they will be placed. And because we're in a downtown area, and I assume they'll be placed on public right of way. And I wonder how big they are or where they're going to be placed.
So generally in the locations that you all picked and that we picked, we'll place them on some sort of utility pole. So what they'll look like is there'll be basically a box on the utility pole, and then there'll be an infrared or a tube, a pneumatic tube that goes across whatever the right of way is, whether it's a bike lane or it's a greenway or it's a sidewalk.
Okay, it's not a tripping hazard then.
No, it would not be a tripping hazard. They're already in place in a lot of parks in Metro Nashville, and I would not say it's a tripping hazard.
Okay.
Councilmember Henderson, I see your hand up.
Yes, Daniel, thank you. So I remember previous presentations about this and how these would look or be posted, but I cannot recall kind of the funding for this or the trigger for this. Obviously, multimodal counts. But I wondered comparatively, I'm familiar with throughout kind of the Nashville region where TDOT has car counters. And so I just wondered, would it be possible to say comparatively, so we're saying between 9 and 15 potential counter locations within the same region, how many counters do we have counting cars? Just for comparison's sake. I'm not saying that's something you should kind of know off the top of your head, but I didn't know if this was kind of grant funded or through what initiative, and as we're looking for kind of balance and making sure that we're spreading these as far and wide as we can. I welcome this. I think it's great, but I also wonder, why isn't it 30 counters or, I know start small and grow, but I was just wondering comparatively if we know, how many intersections on which or on interstates is, where's TDOT counting cars comparatively? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. GNRC staff is in the room. I'm not actually sure how many traffic counters we have. Does anybody here know?
It's a resident application for TDOT that will tell you where they're at, and you go out and
Okay.
We can drop a link in the chat box to the TDOT site that has all the count locations within our region, but I would probably speculate, hundreds of counters for cars within our region.
And then to answer your other question of how it's funded, TDOT has told us that they will be funding the entirety of this project or this program in terms of procuring the counters. I'm not sure if we in the future might have access to additional counters. If maybe there might be an opportunity to expand the program. I think if the pilot goes well, that could be a possibility, but we don't know the answer to that at this time.
Hey, Daniel and
Thank
Council.
you.
This is Ian from TDOT. Yeah, you're right. I'm not exactly sure the exact number of counters. We do have more counters for cars and pedestrians, obviously. I can also help with that link and report back to you. I think any of questions about the ped counters would be better answered by Ashley Hunter Mason. So I'll make sure you continue to have her contact info to keep you updated on those bits of info.
Thanks, Ian, and we'll follow up with these questions with Ashley as well. William, I think you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, Daniel, logistically, where are the counters placed? Using Mount Juliet as an example, Town Center Greenway, will it count the number of pedestrians that leave the WeGo train station or the trailhead? And will that trailhead be from both access points of the current Greenway system?
So I believe I put at one of the trailheads. If we had more counters, we could put them at all access points. But I think to start out in the test phase, we'll look at you and Andy and figure out exactly the best location. Andy actually put the location on the initial map, and so that should represent the trailhead that he thought would be best suited for the counter location.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, we can move on with our agenda. Ashley Glasscock from our data team is going to demo a dashboard for you all.
Okay, so Daniel said I'm going to demo our regional month-to-date dashboard. The dashboard captures crashes between 2015 and as of May of 2021. It is filterable by county, month, year, and by mode. The purpose mainly was to track crashes regionally by month and to compare to previous years, as well as potential uses for safety performance management analysis, as well as system tracking and monitoring.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Window.
Okay. So here you have trend over time, and each one of these various lines represent a different year going back to 2015. And then down below we have the crash distribution month to date going back to 2015. So that's all crashes compared to every previous year up until May 30th. You have the ability, as I said, to filter by county, by mode, by severity. And then I've dropped right here some of the 2021 targets just to kind of keep that familiar. But what I want to show for one is we can look at pedestrians. Look at pedestrians, we can see it change. And so you can see that overall pedestrian crashes are a little lower month to date from previous years. But when I take a look at pedestrian and fatal, crashes, what's interesting is to see is that we are well above any of our previous month-to-date years. And you can see that as well with serious injuries. I think we're a little lower on those. And then you can also see which county is contributing to those fatal pedestrian crashes. So if you want to see amongst the region, we can turn that off and we can look at just Davidson County and see what they're doing. And we can see that they, as a county, are well above the month-to-date average and they're trending well above any of the previous years. You have the ability to do that with any of our modes and severities. And another one I kind of just want to highlight is trucks, which I think is very interesting. You can see that we were up during the pandemic and we're up even way higher in 2021. I think a lot of that can be attributed to a lot of online shopping and online retail, but that's just speculation. But this gives you the ability to explore different options and different trends in the region. And this is still currently under development, so I'm still working out some kinks and still adding some information in. So any feedback you guys have, I welcome. And let me know if you have any questions.
That is great, thanks. It's Robert Johnson. I wonder if you could just clarify about the definition of pedestrian. Do we know what definition that is? At what point is someone making a car trip, for example, how would they become a pedestrian crash or vice versa?
I can pull that from the Department of Safety's database, but it's just basically anyone that's out walking. So they could have parked their vehicle, got out of their vehicle, walked across the street, got hit. They're considered a pedestrian. But I will pull that in for you, so that you're aware of what's included.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's excellent work, by the way. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Does anyone else have any questions before we move on?
I do about, similar to that for trucks. Is that just semi trucks, delivery trucks that include pickup trucks, or what's involved in that?
It's not going to include things like pickup trucks, but it's going to include things that they define as large trucks. I can also pull that exact definition for you from the Department of Safety, but it's basically large delivery trucks all the way up to your semi. I mean, this could be a box truck, like a U-Haul box truck, or this could be something with an 18-wheeler. So I will pull that exact definition for you and get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you for all the good questions. Anybody else have any additional questions before we move on to our discussion? All right, well, I'm going to switch screens again, back to the slides. All right, so last month we had a very productive discussion, debriefing the pedestrian safety workshop and Safe Streets webinar. We discussed a few themes from both events. So first one being it's becoming increasingly unsafe to walk and bike in our region. I think we're all pretty well aware of that. Another one being that we're pretty behind in meeting infrastructure needs for those who walk and bike. There are also competing priorities for space and funding between motorized and vulnerable users. And pretty simply put, our projects continue to experience delays in implementation. So I think two key points that the group had consensus on were that we need to be prioritizing investments in places where we already know it's unsafe based on our crash analyses, and that there needs to be quicker implementation of safety improvements to meet our immediate needs. So to start off, we're going to do a quick poll. So I'll give you a moment to pull out your phones or pull this up on your laptop. I think everyone can see, so you'll go to pollev.com/ I think that's it. Hold on. One second, let me pull up the instructions slide. Okay, so it doesn't look like our poll everywhere is working. So if you could throw your answer to this question in the chat box. So in terms of quick, what is quick build with respect to low cost bike pedestrian project completion? Answer 1 is less than 6 months, between 6 months and 1 year, between 1 and 2 years, between 2 and 5 years, and then 1 and 5 years.
I don't want to.
All right, so it looks like most people are saying at least less than 2 years. A lot of less than 6 months, between 6 months and a year, but almost everybody has chosen at least quicker than 2 years. So to begin our discussion, we're going to go through some typical improvements and how long they've taken historically. And I want to note that this is from the MPO perspective, specifically projects that are federally funded and have to go through the federal review process. But I would be interested to hear from you all in our discussion after these slides about locally and state funded projects, as they may or may not have a quicker implementation timeframe, and what we can learn from that process and challenges that are outside of MPO's perspective. So to orient ourselves in terms of safety improvements available for bicycle and pedestrian users, what you see on the screen is a spectrum based on cost, complexity, and time frame. So on the left, we have low-cost improvements like pedestrian yield signs, shared route signage, and crosswalk striping. These are typically low cost, less complex, and tend to be implemented in a shorter time frame. As we move down the spectrum, we see traffic calming measures and crossing improvements, many of which we learned about in the STEP workshop from a few months ago. There are pedestrian refuge islands, crossing signals, and curb extensions. So that's what fits in the second part of the spectrum. And then, so those tend to be higher in cost and complexity and typically take a little bit longer to implement. And then the next one on the spectrum, if a project contains any reconstructive elements like a roundabout or a road diet, for example, the cost goes up and the design and construction process may take longer. And then on the far right of our spectrum are capacity adding projects like new sidewalks, new greenways, or a multi-use path. These are the most complex projects and typically encounter pretty high right-of-way construction costs, which can significantly slow down the development and implementation process. So to go into a more regional example on some specific projects, I'll hand it off to Anna Emerson, our TIP coordinator, to take us through a few examples that have gone through the development process fairly quickly, as well as some projects that have experienced significant delays.
Awesome, thanks Daniel. Hi everybody, if I've not met you before, I'm Anna Emerson, and like Daniel said, I coordinate our transportation improvement program here at GNRC. It is our short-term 4-year program of funding that we have allocated to projects that we've identified through our long-range transportation plan. So it contains all of the project descriptions and funding that's been provided to those projects, and our local agencies who are implementing those projects, as well as TDOT, use this document kind of as their checkbook as they are implementing their projects. For the sake of our discussion today, we wanted to show you kind of an overview of some bicycle and pedestrian type projects that have been implemented kind of on the quicker side, or at least what's quick in our world, and then show you also some that have experienced more challenges. So just to take a look at some of our kind of quicker or more typical federally funded bicycle and pedestrian type projects that we've had in our TIP over the past few years. We have a sampling here of about 6 projects from across the region, from across GNRC's planning area. You can just take a look here on the slide at what these projects entailed. Most of them were, of course, sidewalk related. We have one full-blown multi-use trail project that we took a look at. Some of these projects were just very straightforward, sidewalks only. Some of them included some crossing or ADA type improvements, some with some streetscaping, along with the work that these local agencies were implementing. We've also added, project links here down toward the bottom. You can see that all of these projects are fairly short lengthwise and kind of ran the gamut on how much they cost to implement. Those contained right away, kind of really plays into what these projects end up costing if the local agency had to purchase additional land for the project. I'll just have Daniel on to the next slide. This slide depicts the timeline of what each of these projects experienced as they were being developed. As you can see, they kind of all average like at least about 4 years to be completed. The different color printing on the bars shows the various work phases of the projects. The NEPA phase, where they were completing their environmental documentation, design phase, where I think sometimes, a project proponent might run into some unforeseen challenges, or maybe just kind of hit an internal lag in moving the project forward. These projects, we've got kind of a fairly lengthy design phase going on. The gray color indicates the right-of-way phase, which only one of these projects has gone through up to this point. And then the lighter blue is construction. A solid blue bar is a project that's complete. They completed construction, and a light blue outline would mean that they're still in the construction phase of work. So, some of those projects may stretch on a little longer than what we have implemented here, but essentially we're just wanting to show that, these all take a fairly long time to go through the various phases of work and get to construction. And again, this is kind of what we would consider on the quicker end of what we're seeing, recently with these types of projects. So now we'll talk about a few that have experienced various delays. This is also a sampling of projects from across our region. Really not vastly different efforts from what we looked at on our previous slides. We have a multimodal path, we have a straightforward sidewalk improvements project. Took place in various phases. So if we could just make sure they're on mute, that would be great. And then we also have a intersection improvement project that, you know, looks strictly at crosswalks, ADA improvements. There was a proposed roundabout that may or may not occur, but mostly safety related intersection improvements. So let's flip on to the next slide and look at the development timeline of these more delayed projects. So we have a lot of different things happening with these projects, and I think these four are kind of a good sampling of some of the barriers that some of our local agencies run into as they're attempting to implement these projects. We'll start with the one up there in Millersville. They are attempting to construct sidewalks along two sides of the state route near the main part of Millersville. They've had some internal issues at the local government that have sort of caused them not to be able to get the project off the ground. They just don't really have a local staff member who can take that project and be its champion and kind of carry it forward into the later phases of development. In Metro, with the Harding Place Sidewalk Enhancement Project. This was just a lengthy project. As I mentioned before, it had multiple phases that it was going to implement the project in over a course of time. And I think some phases have been delayed for various reasons. Most of the federal funding that sponsors are implementing these projects with require a 20% match, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and sometimes local agencies have a hard time coming up with those matching funds, or sometimes just based on other projects that a local agency is working through at the time. You know, one project may no longer be a priority for a period of time. So it's just been a lengthy build out on that particular one. The Jefferson Street Intersections Project, also in Metro, they have been doing a lot of coordinating with the council person in that district, as well as, you know, stakeholders along that corridor. And there's been a lot of back and forth about exactly what they want to see out of that project, what the final design is going to look like. They want everything to be really reflective of the area and the history there. I think there have also been times where this project has just kind of fallen out of priority as well. So this is another project that just has never really gotten off the ground, even though the improvements are much needed for that area. And then the Sanders Ferry Drake Creek Bike Trail, which is in Hendersonville, was also a project that I think just wasn't prioritized for a period of time. They had done their preliminary phases of work, NEPA and design, and then when they were ready to actually jump into construction, their NEPA document had actually expired, needed that period of time that had elapsed while they had been focused on other things. And so they had to kind of go back to square one and reevaluate their NEPA document, and they're still trying to work towards getting that project constructed. So just wanted to provide you with some examples of what can be holdups on these projects, and these are some things that we've seen recently. As you can see, a lot of the projects that we're talking about here, you know, predate my time here at the NPO and at GNRC. Some of them going on for as long as, you know, over 16 years. So I'm happy to take any questions anybody might have about any specifics on these projects we looked over. We can circle back to Daniel.
Sure. Well, I'm going to take a look at the chat.
Well, and just real quick, are the Jefferson Street projects, I thought those were, I mean, it's been a while since I've seen them, but I thought those were widening the intersections to add turn lanes. I don't think those were really bike ped projects.
I mean, if that is where the conversation has gone in, you know, more recent months or more recent years. I don't even know if we're aware of those conversations.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I don't either, honestly.
Hi, sorry, this is Michael Briggs. I can chime in there, having been at Metro. Those projects were currently being rescoped by Public Works in the last couple of years, and they were intended to be focused on, I believe, 2 intersections at Jefferson and 28th, and then at another intersection. And I'm blanking on what the cross street was, but
I think it's 21st.
Yeah, that's right. So they're intended to be pedestrian projects now and not turn lanes. But Public Works can be contacted on the current status of it.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, our goal here isn't necessarily to do a deep dive into any particular project to get to the bottom of anything right at this moment. We more just wanted to demonstrate some of the challenges that projects can run into, even after they've been identified, even once they've gotten as far as, you know, identifying funding for their implementation.
So, Robert, I see your comment. Robert says, my initial reaction is that my stereotype of NEPA being the slowest space is wrong. Also, my stereotype of construction being the fastest space is incorrect on that particular sample. That I don't think that holds up as much on the delayed ones, but he asks on that delayed slide, is this actual status to date? I believe so. Is that correct, Anna?
Yes.
The bars with the dotted bars indicate that work is still in progress.
Correct.
Do you think there are common factors in the projects that do move quickly that we can learn from, or that project sponsors can just be aware of as they're planning for projects to help them move faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think more than anything else, the projects that have moved more quickly, they've been made real priorities by the local agencies who are implementing them. They've not run into any major environmental or stakeholder related issues, and you know, they just stayed on top of them and made sure that these projects were implemented in a timely manner. And you know, that's not to say that the projects that have experienced, you know, those more severe delays, you know, have been, you know, mismanaged in every case, but you know, they've had various challenges, that some that have been, you know, within the control of the implementing agency, and some that haven't been.
Councilmember Henderson, you can ask your question. I see your hand up.
Yes, building on Rochelle's question, I wonder, on the Nashville side, we were seeing that, you know, right-of-way acquisition, when we kind of elevated our standards to have a furnishing zone. You know, Nashville built a series of not great sidewalks that were 5 foot wide right on the roadway because they were within existing right-of-way. And so, you know, I know we've, I think, looked at how to kind of improve that. Obviously, it's complicated when you have, you know, multiple households down a particular street versus 1 or 2 key property owners. Can you speak any more to when that was not a factor in a project? Was it simply because there was no right-of-way acquisition required, or, you know, acquisition of pedestrian easement or any of that? I mean, it seems to show that on the graph that the ones that were quick and delivered, and you know, I sometimes worry that, you know, we're choosing projects because, you know, they're the low hanging fruit or they're easier, and then once we kind of max out on that, potentially even those aren't really great projects because it's not kind of the best, most comfortable or enjoyable infrastructure. And so we kind of just do those to chalk up that we did them. And so I wonder kind of that piece on right-of-way acquisition, what you're seeing trend-wise kind of coming through on that. If you could speak to that some more, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, is your question more targeted at, do you feel like we're seeing projects that are trying to avoid right-of-way acquisition?
I guess so. I just wonder if that's kind of a trend. I mean, I know there's so many factors in sort of, choosing a project, and the simplicity of acquiring the right of way, is one among them. But I just, I don't know. I have not posed that question particularly clearly, but I'm just kind of interested in understanding, just in the scheme of things, as far as, what's been delivered or done previously, what's in progress, like kind of, how is that factoring in, I guess, and that's in a myriad of contexts. So I just, if you have anything more to share particular to, right-of-way acquisition and how that factors in on what's delivered, I'd appreciate that. But if you don't, no worries.
Sure. I mean, just, thinking off the top of my head, I would wager to guess that a lot of our bike path type projects that we have programmed in our TIP don't involve any kind of serious right-of-way acquisition. It certainly makes the project more expensive. It makes the project take more time. In some cases, probably a lot of people on this call know that right-of-way can tie a project up for years, depending on, what types of, arrangements need to be worked out with a landowner adjacent to a project. But I guess that is, maybe something we could consider doing a deep dive into at some point, is exactly what kind of trends we're seeing on the right-of-way issue, and whether it's something that is, causing less desirable projects to, come about because people are trying to avoid right-of-way. That's probably a really good suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to top of mind is, we have, bike lanes that are, paint only on state routes with 45 and 50 mile per hour speed. So yes, we can chalk that up as, we have a bike lane there, but it's not useful or safe for the community. So I just wonder on balance, and I'm not saying if we're doing a repaving, we shouldn't kind of hold the space and go ahead and get that, but I think it sort of plays into that whole narrative of, I never see anybody in the bike lane, and we're all kind of working against ourselves sometimes on that. So whereas I think if we looked at kind of a connected, protected network and what that would take, and yes, will it take more time and cost more? Yes, but if we delivered a more functional, safe network and it took longer, in the end, we might be accomplishing more. I think, we see in various cities when they can do a protected network, like a east-west access, a north-south, that have a, kind of go all in on one key kind of road. And anyway, I just, I'm new to this as far as, looking at it kind of at the state or regional level. But it seems like we've had kind of like, fits and starts and kind of disparate impact and segments here and there. And I'm just wondering if we can kind of make the case, whether through time of delivery or cost or otherwise, that, in the end, not just, striping some paint somewhere or building the 5-foot narrow sidewalk because we don't have to acquire right away and it's simpler. What's the value gain for the community and the state really in doing that? So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think those are all excellent points.
And Councilman Henderson, I think that's exactly what we're hoping will come out of this discussion, and sort of help us. Comments like that will help us create a roadmap for not only quicker implementation but better project design. Robert, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I certainly agree. Councilmember Henderson's got some spot on questions there. Looking at that delayed slide that you're showing now, Anna, thanks very much for this work, because this is great stuff. I look at those blue bars and I'm thinking about how many crashes and fatalities there have been since the project was identified as being worthy, you know, how many crashes there have now been and still not yet implemented. So the implementation delay has real costs to people. Yeah, I think the council members highlighted that there's a balance between the quality and the speed. In general, we might suggest that lower quality projects are faster, and in general, we might suggest that higher quality things like networks are slower. Vision Zero would suggest that you're going to take a systematic approach where in fact you do choose to pick off the low-hanging fruit first, and you do choose to do the faster, potentially lower quality ones first because they're cheaper, and then that number of accidents slows down quite quickly at the beginning, and then later on, as you pick harder and harder and thus more and more expensive ones, the benefits become slower to realize. That's probably how you'd approach it from a safety management system. But the disadvantage of that, I think, is that it doesn't necessarily take quality into account. I know you and Dr. Doris have gone on a lot about the quality of the walking experience, as you exactly raised, things like the furnishing zone, things like street trees. Yeah, and those are slower. And yes, they have a better outcome, but they're slower, so there's more crashes in the intervening period. I guess the real answer, of course, is that you try to have a mixture of both quick win and long-term projects, and you try to have a mixture of both of those going at the same time, and you have to persuade your budget people that yes, there will always be projects proceeding at different speeds. Yeah, definitely excellent questions.
Agreed, Robert. Thank you for summarizing that better than I for pulling all that together. Appreciate it.
Robert, I think that brings up a really good point. So from these projects' perspective, these are all going through a review process. And I think lots of people in school have been more involved, at least than I have, or other GNRC staff have on locally funded projects, and how those have the potential to have a quicker implementation than projects in RTIP and RTP. And so to frame the discussion a little better, I'm going to go to the next slide. So from our NPO perspective, we talked about the top three. So lack of stakeholder coordination, insufficient staff capacity or technical knowledge, and funding constraints being the most common challenges that we saw among those projects that we showed you. So lack of stakeholder engagement really referring to both internal coordination and external coordination, but also refers to issues related to public engagement. So it's Anna mentioned on the Jefferson Street, we've seen community input hasn't necessarily been a focus in some of the projects that have been delayed, and haven't necessarily had buy-in from communities, which is especially important as they're the ones who are impacted most by projects. And then insufficient staff capacity, really referring to each agency's ability to navigate the project development process from each phase to the next. So even if money is available for a project, the agency or project component doesn't have the capacity to see the project through, it could also experience delays. In terms of funding constraints, this refers to the ability of a project component to provide a local match. Most of our federal funding programs require a match from the local or state agency, but this also refers to project cost increases, as we've seen a lot when projects reach construction, their cost tends to increase, which can slow the project down as well. So those bottom three, difficulties competing for limited funding, so that's referring to there's generally more funding available for motorized improvements related to congestion or other elements, but also that locals may not have enough funding to spend on projects in general. And then design guidelines in sensitive context, that refers to state and local transportation agency design manuals, which may differ. So projects with shared ownership might experience delays because of that. And then finally, the NEPA process, which you mentioned, Robert, that has caused a lot of delays in projects as well. So I bolded those top three because that's what we feel are the most common challenges among our NPO projects. But I would imagine that those bottom three are also huge challenges for local and state agencies or any other project proponents. So if anyone wants to take a stab at answering any of these questions, so the first being, are these common challenges that you have experienced? Do these challenges hold true for locally funded projects? Are there additional challenges that are not captured here? And then are there specific challenges that are higher priority? And really the goal of this is to figure out what we need to prioritize so that we can start figuring out a solution for speeding projects. Like you said, Robert, those temporary fixes, which we usually refer to as quick build projects, but in our definition of quick build from the MPO perspective, may not actually be the same as yours. So if anyone wants to take a stab at answering any of these questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hey there, this is Michael Briggs. So kind of having both worked for a local government and then now at the university, I think anytime that you're using federal funding when it's a pass through with TDOT, it just becomes really lengthy. And I think where we've experienced it is related both to some NEPA issues where things just change with the project and you sometimes have to rescope it. And so then that will sometimes trigger a new NEPA evaluation. And then we've been running, and it's not the same kind of funding that we've really been talking about, but with some of the CMAQ funding, and anything that's related to infrastructure, we're running into a lot of issues related to Buy America and NEPA, just because they're, and I think the intent of Buy America was obviously good to kind of help push production of steel and iron components into the US, but it's slowing down a lot of like really small projects. And so like just things like bike racks getting purchased, both at the city level when I was at Metro and then also at Vanderbilt. So there's some things that are, there's kind of like these small parameters that I think were intended for like really large infrastructure and construction projects that get translated to a lot of these smaller projects, which a lot of the bike and sidewalk projects can kind of fall into, but kind of get held up with some of the federal regulations and interpretations that are often conveyed through federal highway down to TDOT. And I'm not sure, I don't know if this is the case like with every federal highway division or if it's consistent across, you know, like different state federal highway divisions and DOTs, but I think there's a lot of interpretation that goes on right there. And I don't know if there's a way to leverage what some other state DOTs or federal highway divisions are doing in some of these areas to help speed up the process to have a conversation at the DOT and federal highway level on it. So yeah, I would say a local project, if it's something that just has local funds, it can get done a lot quicker, but it has other challenges that come up dealing with stakeholders and property owners that can be the pitfall. And then anytime it's involving federal funds, you have to add in the layer of making sure that you're meeting a lot of the federal guidance and regulations, which are important. So, you know, by me saying this, I'm not saying that we want to completely forgo you know, those regulations, but it definitely slows down the process. And then by the time you're getting answers on this, things begin to change with the project or property owners change or, you know, people are ready to move on to a different thing. So it becomes really hard to implement.
I think that's a really great point, or a lot of really great points. So you're saying, even if we funded it locally, it doesn't necessarily take down all the barriers. It may just bring up new barriers in terms of project implementation. And I think that's really what we're trying to figure out here is we're more transparent about the challenges that each of our projects are facing, and if we do more detailed analysis on each of those challenges, then we can come up with a better solution, both on federally funded projects and locally and state funded projects, so that these quick build projects or projects, for instance, on any of our major pikes where we're seeing most of the pedestrian fatalities, if we can do what Robert was saying, which is more like intermediate phasing and getting around some of these challenges by being a little bit more creative in how we design projects and how we move them through the process. Does anybody else have any comments?
Daniel, this is Councilwoman Henderson. I would say, as a district or local council member, and when we look at infrastructure projects and kind of the stakeholder community aspect of that, I think again sometimes we struggle with kind of the piecemeal approach, and I don't necessarily mean that in a negative standpoint, but just what segment of this can we fund at this time, and by whom and where. And I think sometimes, and I'll kind of go back to speaking about networks, right? Like you're kind of getting into an argument about, a particular stretch of bikeway or sidewalk or, a road diet or, and the kind of the community education piece about understanding the bigger picture of things. So sometimes it's like we're not having the right conversations. And then when you get into kind of the jurisdictional things, Mr. Briggs will recall kind of the, notorious in Nashville of late. And I think kind of GNRC funded in part, right? We had looking at, I guess, is that, can never remember if it's 8th Avenue, Franklin Pike State Route, City of Berry Hill as a jurisdiction, looked at that area, engaged their kind of stakeholder and business community. They had support around something, but then how that fit into the larger network, then we had my constituents who think of that road only as something that they just, drive down real fast, from their community of Oak Hill on through to downtown. And then, kind of the subsequent, Berry Hill, City of Oak Hill, TDOT, people being opposed and sort of, going at the smaller municipality, which is already a municipality within a municipality. Like, some of that kind of cross jurisdictional kind of communication and education around building networks. A lot of what I'm trying to do as a legislator that represents, multiple satellite cities, but adjacent to Brentwood is, kind of try to facilitate conversations among all these jurisdictions so that, you're speaking about bigger picture network connection type things. And it's not, so, I mean, I know as in kind of a regional organization, GNRC, I think, thinking about that kind of stakeholder communication piece of any particularly funded project and how that fits into the kind of the bigger picture of the network can kind of cut off, or I don't mean cut off community conversation, but just kind of get in front of, because once it kind of gets sideways, it's really hard to kind of pull it back together in a constructive way. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents on sometimes that aspect of the delay.
I think that's a really great point, Councilwoman Henderson. So that's more of the lack of stakeholder coordination and not being on the same page in terms of what the community wants versus a different community, because so many of our roadways go through multiple communities. Does anybody have any response to any of the comments that have been offered up so far? Does anybody have any comments on these bottom two questions? So are there challenges? I know Robert put in the chat that he thought these captured our challenges pretty well. But are there any that haven't been captured? William, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Daniel, I've noticed in some of our projects that responsibility of infrastructure is divided among city and personal property owners. And this has created some challenges for grants that the city of Mount Juliet has been awarded. In this particular case, the city will maintain the infrastructure, such as sidewalks, in front of a property owner, but the town of Watertown places that burden on the property owner. So there's oppositions that we run into of providing grant funds that the property owners do not want to see as a result of having to maintain the infrastructure after the projects are completed. And also wonder how many are having challenges with projects or funding that has statewide interest in spreading infrastructure among the entire state, where we might be restricted from applying for a particular fund simply because there are greater needs in other part of the state. I don't know if that presents a challenge for other communities, but possibly other funding challenges that we might face in trying to approach funds for infrastructure.
That's a really great point. Does anybody else on the call have you experienced that in project development? All right, so I think we haven't really had an answer to the last question. So among these challenges, and any other challenges you may have experienced, are there challenges we need to prioritize? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Robert Johnson, lack of stakeholder coordination slightly bleeds over into all of the other categories. Well, of course, all of the categories bleed over into each other. That's the problem. But lack of stakeholder coordination, I did hear a couple of people talking about scope changes, and not just scope creep, but completely scope changes. A turn lane project is not the same as a sidewalk project. So that was clearly scope change. So stakeholder coordination at the beginning would, I believe that better stakeholder coordination would smooth the way at multiple other challenges listed there on the left-hand side. It means you could, if you knew what the project was and you were pretty happy about what it was going to be, well, that would mean you could take on the right staff and you could recruit the right people. It then means that your funding would be much more certain if it was definitely, everybody knew what it was going to fund. If you were competing against other projects, well, if your scope doesn't change and all of the local community is on board, then the competing people are at least aware of the project, even if you haven't got them on board. The design guidelines are going to be more sensitive because you've consulted the right people at the beginning about what the project is going to do. Even NEPA is probably improved by better stakeholder coordination. So of all of your common challenges you have there on the left-hand side, I feel like stakeholder coordination, which is perhaps the least easy to define, that you've done it well, actually has quite considerable knock-on effects to all other phases of a project.
I would agree with that, Robert. I think that tackling stakeholder coordination can have positive effects on all of the other challenges, and could, in terms of bike ped projects, could, and actually really any transportation project could speed up the process in terms of solving all of the other challenges as well. Anybody else have any answers to that last question before we move on? All right, so in our next meeting, we're not going to meet next month. We'll take the month of July off. But in addition to the follow-up with the council program and confirming our locations, I think we'll continue this conversation in August, hopefully in person, on what some potential opportunities to address the challenges that we talked about today in terms of speeding up project delivery. Addressing the delays in project delivery. So think about that in the next month or so, and we'll come back in August to discuss that. So I'll go quick with the GNRC updates. We recently opened our call for projects for the pre-application portion of the COVID relief funds. So I presented this last time, but just as a reminder, this is the funding available across all levels of government. So nationally, there's about 10 billion available, with 210 million available at the state level, 22.4 million at the MPO level, and about 8 million for our region specifically. So our Transportation Coordinating Committee and Policy Board voted that these are the types of projects that are the highest priority. I won't go through all of these examples, but roadway safety improvements, non-motorized facilities, traffic calming, ITS improvements, transit fleet modernization, sidewalk connectivity, ADA improvements, a lot of safety and bike ped focused projects is what we're looking for. And then as far as the application process, the pre-application is due by July 14th, and the full application is due by August 20th. In my agenda email, I guess a week ago, I included the link to the spec sheet on the right, as well as the pre-application form. This is the general schedule for the program. As I said, the pre-application is due on July 14th. Then we'll move into the evaluation internally, as well as the formal application period. And then those are due on August 20th, and then we'll evaluate them and then announce awards on September 15th. So does anybody have any questions on the COVID relief funds before I move into two other updates? All right. So FHWA released information on this new program, so the Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, the RAISE grant program. Some of you may know it as the Build and Tiger program, but this is the new iteration. The objectives are to improve racial equity, reduce impacts of climate change, and create good paying jobs. It's about $1 billion nationwide, but no more than 100 million to a single state. Eligible projects include capital and planning projects, and the maximum award is 25 million. I'll include more information in a follow-up email, but the deadline for that is July 12th. And then I'll quickly hand it to Robert at TDOT to announce the multimodal access grant awardees.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel. We administer in my office $18 million of grant money per year. And we just announced that last week. So there are the winners within this GNRC MPO area, those 4 towns listed down at the bottom. A couple of other good news items to go with that is that this is a 95% state, 5% local community match. So slightly better than the 80-20 that is typical with other federal grants. This is entirely state funded grant, and it can cover all phases of a project. It has to include construction, but it can cover all phases of a project. So not just construction or not just planning, but all the way through. Yeah, and there are the winners. It's interesting that each grant is up to $1 million, and I think everybody there, with the exception of Murfreesboro, did get the absolute maximum amount. They asked for $950,000, and they were going to have to match $50,000, and those were all winners. Those bottom 4. And then, yeah, of course there were people who didn't win. We granted, I think in the end it's 23 winners this year of that $18 million, but there were north of 60 applicants for well over $55 million worth of work. So huge demand, and people had to drop off the bottom because there was just such a huge demand, and nearly all of the applications were great. I mean, they really were. All of the applications were great. It was just somebody has to lose. Any questions? Go ahead. Beg your pardon, before you do that, our next round of grants, the same, almost exactly identical grant round, we're going to open in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. Hot news there potentially is that next week we will open the next round of grants. We're going to try and squeeze in another $18 million award cycle within this year. Try and get that in before January 2022. So that's the hot news there, but I'll be publishing that hopefully in the next week. But yeah, any questions? Go ahead.
Robert, question from Councilmember Henderson. I'm wondering, when you all get, 60 applicants for $55 million worth of work, we've talked about this program being 18 million statewide, right? That's spreading pretty thin for Bike Ped in my view. And something I hope that, we're talking about as a bigger group. How are we making the connection with the state budget, the assigned committee to say, here's this program that we've had for X number of years, funded at 18 million. All 60 of these applications are excellent for 55 million worth of work. Next budget year, we'd like to see the multimodal access grant funded at $30 million. Like, who's having that conversation? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that Preston Elliott, the Bureau Chief of Planning within TDOT, is certainly very enthusiastic, and who you may know formerly worked for RPM Consultancies, KCI Consultancy. So a big ped bike advocate. He is certainly having those conversations with the Commissioner of Transport. I'm CC'd on those emails, so I know that he is definitely pushing. I think the program has gone up from $7 million to the $18 million over the course of, I want to say, 6 years. So it's risen at that speed. And yes, we down at the actual implementation level certainly highlight the enormous gap between supply and demand. We certainly do, and it seems like there's not a lot of pushback internally within the technical people. I can't talk to you about how the commissioner feels, the commissioner of TDOT feels about it, but certainly at every step below the commissioner himself, yes, it's actually seen as a very popular program. The fact that it's entirely TDOT state money is quite trumpeted actually by the state legislatures, especially in the smaller communities. They like to trumpet that here is your local tax dollars going to your local sidewalks. And as you can see, that's a very popular line to use because of the number of applicants we receive. So I feel that politically, council member, yes, there is pressure to increase that budget. It does increase, and what's stopping it increase further? No, I don't know. I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you, Robert. I will plug one thing. 2 weekends ago, I participated in the Juneteenth ride that Tina and Cedric put on. It was a really great ride. I did the 25-mile ride, but I know that in the future, both of them will be putting on some more rides. So I encourage everyone on this call to check out Black Girls Do Bike and Bike for Equality, because I think that those efforts are really important in improving safety for especially biking, but bikes and pedestrians. Does anyone else have any updates or events coming up? Feel free to unmute yourself.
It's Bill McCord over in Gallatin. One of the projects that was discussed today briefly is the Rucker Stewart Safe Routes to School project. And for the most part, that's been completed. There's obviously some cleanup, literally, and things of that sort. And hopefully it'll rain again and the grass will grow. But the sidewalk is completed and can be used by the public, and includes a crosswalk with push buttons at Hancock Street and 109. So that's a big achievement that we've nearly completed, and it's functionally in use. And we're looking forward to our next one starting that will connect the west side to the east side of town.
That's great to hear. Thank you, Bill. Anybody else have an update?
Hello, Daniel. This is Peter Westerholm. Can I mention something real quick?
Sure, go ahead, Peter.
All right, thanks. Many of the folks on this call in this meeting may be aware of this, but I believe Metro Parks board is going to have a meeting next week to have a discussion about e-bikes on the greenways. And I think it's going to be an interesting conversation to watch and see how that unfolds. But I think it's also been related to the redeployment of the B-cycle bicycle fleet, which, as I understand, was intended to be exclusively e-bikes when they return this summer. And so I think that's going to be just an interesting conversation to watch. And maybe something that we want to bring into our conversation at some point in the future.
Thank you, Peter. I think that'll be a really interesting conversation as well. Anybody else before we adjourn today have an update? All right, well, thank you to everyone who joined today, and thanks for the really, really good discussion. We'll be reaching out with a follow-up with materials that are relevant to the meeting that we had today, as well as the counts information for you all to check out. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you in August.
Thank you.